When people think about the time of Jesus, a familiar image usually comes to mind. Dusty roads, simple clothes, sermons being given, and miracles being told, as if people in that era lived inside a sacred story rather than ordinary daily life. But for those who actually lived then, life was not centered on theology. It was centered on survival, more precisely on the struggle to survive. Historically, the world Jesus was born into existed under one of the harshest and most unequal economic systems the Mediterranean had ever seen. This system did not just create inequality, it made sure it lasted. Welcome to Finance Across History. On this channel, we look at history not just as a sequence of events, but through the movement of money. Empires are rarely held together by belief alone. They are held together by economic flows. And if you want to truly understand a system, the first thing to see is where the wealth is going. At the beginning of the 1st century, Judea was under the control of the Roman Empire, which had built one of the most efficient economic extraction systems in history, not only through military power, but through administrative sophistication. For Rome, conquest was not about integrating territories, it was about producing revenue for the center. The outer regions existed not for their own prosperity, but to supply Rome. Taxes, agricultural goods, metals and labor all flowed steadily toward the empire's core, and this flow rarely changed direction. Judea was one of the more fragile parts of this system. The region was largely rural, land was limited, production uncertain, and most families worked plots barely enough to feed themselves. Today, a bad harvest means less profit. Back then, a bad harvest meant hunger, and Rome did not adjust expectations. Judea was governed through local rulers and appointed governors. Kings like Herod ruled with Roman approval, and the governors who followed were not tasked with improving living conditions. Their role was simple: maintain order and ensure taxes were collected. The tax system was relentless. People did not pay based on earnings, they paid because they existed. There were land taxes, crop taxes, head taxes, tolls on roads and markets, and on top of all that, religious obligations. A bad year did not reduce what you owed. A failed harvest did not cancel payments. Even without income, debt remained. Taxes were often collected not by state officials, but by contractors who paid Rome in advance, and then recovered both their money and profit from the population. Harsh collection was not an accident, it was the system. If you could not pay, you borrowed. Debt was everywhere, but not like modern debt. There was no bankruptcy protection, no restructuring, no safety net. Interest accumulated, land was used as collateral, and one bad year meant borrowing, 2 bad years meant interest growth, and 3 bad years often meant losing the land entirely. Losing land was more than losing property. It meant losing security, status, and social position. Many farmers became tenants on what had been their own fields. Some became day laborers, some disappeared entirely into poverty. This was not unusual, it was the norm. Over time, small landholdings disappeared, large estates grew, and wealth concentrated among those connected to Rome and local elites, while everyone else lived closer and closer to the edge. The economy did not just produce poverty, it reproduced it, and there was no system to catch those who fell. Losing land meant there was no institutional support, no aid, no appeal. The only safety net was the family, and sometimes even that was not enough. Debt was not only financial, it was social. Identity was tied to land, and losing it meant losing honor, security, and future. A drought, a tax increase, or a single missed payment could alter the fate of a family. This was the world Jesus was born into. It must be said clearly, people were not poor because they were lazy, immoral, or cursed. They were poor because the system required it. Rome demanded surplus, local elites demanded rent, the temple demanded revenue, and all this pressure fell on those with the least ability to survive. In such a place, there was no calm, only tension. Judea was full of it. Revolts erupted, banditry increased, movements promising justice appeared. People longed for change, not out of comfort, but because they were trapped. At the center of all this stood the institution people believed would protect them: the temple. Most imagine the temple in Jerusalem as purely religious, but it was also one of the region's most powerful economic institutions. It functioned as a treasury, a tax center, and a financial authority. Every adult Jewish male had to pay the temple tax. It was compulsory. Payment had to be made in a specific silver coin, which forced people to exchange their money, and money changers profited from this process. Animals for sacrifice were sold inside the temple system. Prices were controlled, and even the poor brought smaller offerings but still paid. Religious obligations did not replace Roman taxes, they were layered on top. Temple leadership was closely tied to Roman power, creating a deep contradiction. The temple preached justice, but the system produced inequality. It preached forgiveness, but everyone lived in debt. It preached holiness, but access required payment. People saw this, and resentment grew. Jesus began speaking in this world. When he spoke of debt, people heard real debt. When he spoke of freedom, they heard real freedom. When he spoke of the poor, they saw their own lives. And one day, in the temple, tables were overturned. This was not merely a religious protest. It was an economic challenge. After that moment, everything changed. Rome tolerated teachers, even critics, but not instability. Revolt erupted. Rome responded. Jerusalem was besieged, and the temple was destroyed. But the system did not end. Taxes continued, debt continued, land loss continued. Rome gained control, but not complete control of the narrative, because once people begin questioning why suffering exists, the system becomes harder to justify. A system remains strong as long as people believe it is necessary, and when that belief fades, even the largest empire can falter. Jesus did not raise an army, write an economic plan, or build a state, but he challenged the idea that debt was destiny. Sometimes, ideas are more dangerous than weapons. Rome controlled territory, but not meaning. History shows something uncomfortable. Unjust systems do not collapse simply because people suffer. They collapse when the stories justifying suffering lose credibility. Finance Across History explores exactly this: how power is built, how it endures, and how it begins to unravel once people stop believing in it.